Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to finally go over the concept of time as it relates to the nature of manifestation. Right? So the basic set of ideas that I'm going to use and relate to manifestation, the general term for it in the spiritual community is called quantum reality shifting. Right? So that's what I put there. This isn't something I created, although you're probably not going to hear it quite in these terms, right, if you hear it anywhere else. But this is a general idea that exists, like I said, in the spiritual community. But I've kind of adapted it to the concept of the subconscious, right? So to go into it, actually, let me just also say that this idea is really going to give us the sort of proper language and proper sort of framework to understand manifestation. At least that's what I believe. At least in terms of how I've come to look at it. So we're going to talk about a little bit of quantum mechanics, right? So we're talking about quantum mechanics first, right? Go into that a little bit, and then we're going to go into more into the concept of time altogether, and then relate that to manifestation, right? So to go over this first point, it says quantum particles experience a phenomenon called superposition, right? So we basically talked a little bit about that before, if you're already in the physics and you already know what that is. But just to go into it, basically superposition is the process by which particles can basically exist in multiple states at once, right? So a quantum particle is basically described in quantum mechanics by something called a wave function, right? Which is a vector, if I'm not mistaken, a state vector. It's treated like a state vector, but it's called a wave function, and the wave function contains all the information about all the observable values for the quantum particle, right? So observable is basically just something, is a quantity or characteristic of a quantum particle that you can measure, right? So that could be like position, the location of the particle, the momentum of the particle, or its energy. Things like that would be observables, right? Now, experiments, right? So experiments that looked at quantum phenomena, right? So I think particularly double slit experiment is one. That double slit experiment is one of them. Those experiments shown that the observable values, the observable values for quantum phenomena, right? The values of the observables for quantum phenomena actually exist in a state of superposition, right? So, like I said, it has multiple values at one time. So, for the position, for example, a quantum particle could be here, 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 and here, right? For at the quantum realm. Now, that doesn't make any sense, right? That doesn't happen at all for macroscopic phenomena, right? So, this marker, for example, is right here, and that's it, right? It's not here, here, and here. But for a quantum particle, it actually is here, here, and here at the same time. So that is the concept of superposition. Now, this was discovered, I forget when, pretty much in the early 20th century, I imagine. That's when you basically had a whole bunch of people look at I think that's actually called the second scientific revolution, right? Sometimes it's referred to as that. And that was basically when Einstein discovered relativity, and you had a lot of scientists kind of looking into quantum phenomena for the first time. So that would be like Niels Bohr, Max Planck, to name some of them. Who else? Aaron Schrodinger, Werner Heisenberg. Dirac, I think, came a little later. de Broglie was another one. But yeah, so they were discovering these ideas, right, around that time. And this concept was very weird to them, right? So you can imagine it's pretty much accepted today. But at that time, it was very strange, right? They presumed they had something wrong, right? It didn't quite make sense, right? That a particle should be in multiple positions at once. But that seemed to be the proper explanation theoretically, right? And it's pretty much survived up until today. And in the process of trying to understand this and juxtapose this with their measurements, they're trying to come up with equations and a sort of basically they're coming up with quantum mechanics, right? So they're coming up with the theoretical framework to help them understand quantum phenomena, right? So one of them was this, Then you also had the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which said you can only know, there's certain canonical variables or conjugate variables that you can only know within a certain degree of accuracy at the same time, right, or certain pairs. So the one most recognized is position and momentum. And then they also created the Schrodinger wave equation, which basically said that the best you can do to describe the location or describe certain observables for a quantum phenomena or quantum particle is basically the best you can do is give a probability of what you're going to measure if you measure it, right? They basically recognize that we can't give you a sort of an equation that has an equal sign, right? So kind of like classical mechanics, right? So we can't give you an equation which says that if you start off with these sort of initial conditions, right, and some particle, you exert a force or some influence a particle in some way, right? Let's say there's no other forces acting on it or no other influences. Classical mechanics says exactly where that particle is going to be with that influence or that force exerted on it. And they basically realize in quantum mechanics that you can't really do that, right? The best you can do is get a differential equation, right, which is Schrodinger wave equation, set up some type of boundary conditions or initial conditions to get uniqueness. And then after that, the best you can do is get a probability of what you're going to measure. So if I measure the energy, then the eigenvalue of the Hamiltonian will give me the probability, right, of measuring that energy. Or the square, I think it's the square root of the square of the Hamiltonian, something like that, right? But basically the eigenvalue of the Hamiltonian will be proportional to that value, right? It'll give me the probability of measuring the energy of the particle and coming out with a certain value, right? So I'll get a certain set of eigenvalues, and the eigenvalue of the highest value will be the highest probability. One with the lowest value will be the lowest probability in terms of measuring the energy. So that's basically what they realized, right? And so like I said, that was very strange for them, right? A lot of people didn't like that, right? Einstein was known, he was well known for saying, the classic quote is attributed to him, right? Which, that's not exactly what he said, but it's close enough. So he's known for saying, God does not play dice, right? So in other words, he believed in that it wasn't necessarily the case, right, that the best you could do, or at least no, he believed that it wasn't necessarily the case that that you couldn't quite get you couldn't precisely predict an observable value due to, in a way that wasn't due to simply limitations on your, the tools you can use for measurement, right, in other words. In other words, what he was trying to say was that nature itself, if we could create a sort of ideal measuring device, right? We weren't limited by technology in some way, right? If we could create a perfect measuring device, then of course we can get enough information about a quantum particle to know exactly where it's going to be later, right? Now, what quantum mechanics says is no, right? If you could create the perfect measuring device, you still couldn't know because nature is inherently distorted in a way, right? Which is quantum superposition, right? This particle exists in multiple positions at once. There's just no way to know what's going to happen when you actually measure. Actually, I forgot to mention, what quantum mechanics says is that when you measure the particle, right? When you measure the particle, what's called the wave function. So the wave function collapses, right? And when it collapses, now the particle only has a singular observable value. So if we're measuring, for example, position, right, the particle would exist in multiple positions at once, right? And then the moment we measure it, now the particle is in a singular position, right? And that's called wave function collapse. Now, what they didn't understand, right, around this time is why that happens, right? Why before you measure it, is it in multiple locations at once for the position operator? And then after you measure it, now it's in one position, right? So that's something that they never, even to this day, they still don't really understand the answer to that. Some people have come up with what's called a hidden variable theory, or hidden variables theory, which says that there are hidden variables that if we had those variables, then we could treat it just like classical mechanics and say exactly where it's going to be later based on some initial set of conditions, right? But those theories, I think, largely have been, I don't know if they've been disproven, but they largely have seemed to be incorrect, or the evidence more and more shows those are most likely not true, that it is exactly what the current accepted theory of quantum mechanics says, which I believe is came out of the Copenhagen interpretation. Right, so Copenhagen interpretation was basically just a get together of a whole bunch of scientists during that time. I think it was in Denmark, right, where they just kind of got together and trying to come up with ideas to really explain a lot of the experiments and the sort of assorted set of ideas they had in a day. And I believe they came up with the Copenhagen interpretation, which basically part of that says that the wave function, which we would use to describe a quantum, or which contains within it all the information about the observables of a quantum particle, they basically came up with the idea that it just collapses. We don't know why it collapses, it just collapses, right? So in other words, in quantum mechanics, you have something called an operator, right? So you can have like a Hamiltonian operator or a position operator, and when they act on the wave function, that's basically equivalent to measuring something in real life, right? So if I measure the position of a quantum particle, right, mathematically that would be represented by having the position operator act on the state vector or the wave function. Now, the moment I do that, now the wave function collapses. So now it no longer contains information about all these different positions, right, that the quantum particle was in. So the quantum particle was in, at one point it was in this position, it was here, 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 and here. Now when I measure it, it's just here and that's it, right? So basically the wave function only has information about the particle being in this position, so that's all I'm going to get if I keep measuring it over and over and over again, right? So basically, I just bring that up to say that that's something that even to this day, no one knows why. That's the accepted theory on what happens when you measure a quantum particle. The wave function collapses, but we don't know why it collapses. So now that was one explanation, though, right? So another explanation was the hidden variables theory, which has largely turned out not to be sound, right? But there was another explanation to try to explain what happens, that's the kind of one I'm going to really talk about in this video. So the other explanation is called the many worlds theory. So the many worlds theory says that what's actually happening is that when a particle is in a state of superposition, so if it's here, 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 and here, many worlds theory says that it's actually in different realities, in a sense, or even different universes. So in one universe it's here, another universe it's here, another universe is here, and so on and so forth, right? Now what it says is that when we measure the quantum particle, right, so if we try to measure its position, what ends up happening is that we slip, right? So who knows why, right? So it's the same problem. We don't know why it happens, but it says that we slip into one of the realities that the quantum particle was in. So if I measure a quantum particle, if it's here, 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 and here, before I measure it, and then I measure it, and then when I measure it, it's here. What many worlds theory says is that I slipped into the reality where it was here and not the other realities. So that's why I measure it here. Now, again, you're pretty much swapping one sort of mystery for another mystery, right? Why did I slip into that reality? No one really knows, right? But that is the many worlds interpretation, right? So it doesn't, in a sense, you could say it doesn't really offer much new, but it is an interesting interpretation, of what's happening, right? In other words, the wave function isn't necessarily collapsing per se with this theory. Rather, you slipped into another reality, right? Now, another thing you might say is, well, if I slip into this reality, how does that affect, I don't know, someone far from me, right? Let's just say far from me, right? Keep it simple, right? Am I in some new universe, right? With new people and new things happening, right? And whoever, the person who is far from me, who presumably shouldn't be affected by that measurement, right? Is he in the original universe, and now we're in new universes, right? So that's an interesting sort of question for the many worlds theory. People sort of answer that question a little differently. I like to think of it as people are actually entangled Actually, no, I think this is one of the normal interpretations of it, right? Is that people actually entangle. So quantum mechanics entanglement largely, my memory serves me, it largely just means that the quantum states of two particles are connected in a sense, right? So in other words, normally in quantum mechanics, I don't think this applies to bosons, but pretty much any other particle, if I'm correct, any other particle, two quantum particles can't have the exact same quantum state, right, within a particular energy level. All right, so in other words, in an atom, for example, if you're at the lowest energy level, you can't have two particles with all exactly identical what's called quantum numbers, but specifically they're just not in the same quantum state. And that's called the Pauli exclusion principle. However, right, you can have a particle here and here, so they're not in the same energy level, they're nowhere near each other, but their quantum states are still connected in a sense, right? In other words, if this particle is in this state, then that limits the states that this particle over here can have. So that's my understanding of entanglement. And what the many worlds theory says is that we're all entangled in a sense. Some people might say we're all part of the wave function, initial wave function. So the wave function normally just talks about the particle itself. But some interpretations of the many worlds theory says, no, we're all part of the wave function. So if I measure a quantum particle and I slip into the reality where the quantum particle was here, then everyone slips into the reality. Or at least everyone in the local experiment also slips into that reality. And some might say that people far away are in some original reality that's different, but I tend to believe that everyone's entangled and we all sort of slip into the same reality, right? So that's pretty much the many worlds theory in a nutshell. So now, why is that important for anything that we're talking about with the subconscious, with time, and the nature of manifestation? Well, I believe largely that the many worlds interpretation is actually how time itself works, right? And to go over this next point, it says time is not necessarily a linear progression of events, right? Because we think of time as being sort of a one-dimensional sort of flow, right? So we flow from the past to the future. If we had the ability to look in the future, it would be fixed, right? If we had the ability to look at, see tomorrow, there would be a fixed set of events, right? And it's not changeable, right? It's already going to happen. There's nothing I can do to prevent the future or change it, right? We presume it's just a linear flow, one-dimensional flow. But I don't necessarily think that's true, though, right? I think that actually time, and this is, by the way, is sort of alluded to in many near-death experiences, right? Many near-death experiences will say that time is actually they'll say that all the events that have ever happened and could happen have already happened, right? Past, present, and future, right? In one book, it was kind of stated that time is kind of like everything's already happened, but there's a particular set of events or chain of events that you can experience, right? So in other words, all the possible events already exist, but you can experience them in more local ways, right? In the local, in the sense a local chain of events in a way. So for example, let's say tomorrow. Tomorrow for me can be many different possible events, right? But I can experience particular outcomes at a singular time. I'm not able to experience them all at once, all the possible events, right? But yeah, when I go tomorrow, I will only experience particular events at once. So to me, it looks like that event was fixed for the future, but it wasn't, right? It was actually, before I actually got to the tomorrow, it was actually a series of possible events, perhaps infinite possible events. And what the book I was listening to an audio book for it. What it basically said is that life is almost like a game, right? Like in a game contains all the possible sort of ways of experiencing the game, right? All the possible events that game could sort of offer are all contained within the game. Let's say you have a disc, right? Now, when you play the game, you only experience those events at a time, right? And you can experience a particular chain of events at a particular time, right? In some games, if you play it like in a certain way, you may even get different endings, right? So I remember that when I used to play games for like Super Nintendo and whatnot, right? So that basically represents the ending you get depends on how you played the game, what choices you made as you played the game, right? And you got different outcomes, right? That's how time works, right? So time is actually a set of, if you look at time, the universe the universe actually consists of all possible events, at least looking at it from the perspective of time. And as you move through time, right, you're actually experiencing a singular set of events, or a single set of events one at a time, right? But time actually consists of all possible events at once, throughout all of history, really, and eternity, presumably, right? So now the interesting question is, if tomorrow, let's say tomorrow for me consists of, let's say, an infinite number of possible events, right? There are infinite ways for me to experience tomorrow. What determines how tomorrow appears to me if I'm not experiencing them all at once, right? I'm only going to experience a particular type of tomorrow, right, out of the infinite types of tomorrows, right? What determines which specific one I experience? Well, the way I like to think of it is I like to set it up in a way that's very similar to the many worlds theory. In other words, I first want to start off with something like a wave function, right? So the wave function, like I said, contains within it all the information about a quantum particle. When looking at the nature of time, I like to think of there being something like a time function, right? So the time function is basically contains within it all the possible events in the universe, right? So the time function basically contains all the possible tomorrows that I could possibly experience, which is presumably an infinite amount, right? Now, in that case, what determines, how do we interact with this time function to determine which one of the possible tomorrows I actually experience? Well, to go over this third point here, it says the time function contains information about all past, future events as well as the present. Actually, I already went over that. Go to this next point. It says free will / choices cause the time function to collapse. Right? In other words, the time function, we interact with the time function, right, through our free will, right? So the wave function for a quantum particle, we would interact with the wave function for that quantum particle by trying to measure the quantum particle in some way, which usually means interacting with it through light or photons or something like that, right? But for the time function, which contains information about every possible event in reality throughout time, right, we interact with it through our free will, right? And again, this is something you see all the time in near-death experiences, right? They will often say that the future isn't fixed, right? That our choices will determine what future we experience. In fact, some near-death experiences actually make predictions about the future, right? And then when some of them will come true and then some don't, and then people will say, oh, that cruise in near-death experience wasn't a supernatural event, it was just something in someone's head. No, right? That again is stars and stripes fallacy, just placing some random condition on reality. No. What the near-death experiences say over and over again is that we have the ability to change the future, right? At any particular point, the future may look a particular way, or you may have a particular probability of having a certain future, just like quantum mechanics, right? When you measure a quantum particle and you measure its the eigenvalue will tell you the probability of getting a certain measurement if you were to measure the particle, but that's not guaranteed. That's the same thing with the way the future is, right? You can look into the future at any time and see a particular outcome, and we'll talk a little more about that later. But I'll just go over it now. So if you can look into the future and get it is possible to look into the future and get a particular, what you would see, right? If let's say you use psychic abilities and looked into the future, which I don't recommend, right? Unless you have God's permission for that. But if you did that, you would generally see the probability, or the highest probability, right, of what's going to happen from the current time, right? And this used to happen to me all the time, right? So I forgot to mention that this idea, I didn't just get from this, like I said, I didn't come up with this idea, but I didn't just get this idea from other videos talking about this quantum reality shifting. I actually kind of got this idea from when I used to use psychic abilities, right? So I used to, illegally, by the way, right? So I was doing it against God's will, which is why he warned me to stop, right? But I used to actually look into the future. And I won't go into how because I don't want people doing that. It's kind of obvious if you sort of understand everything I was mentioning. But when I would do it, I used to also think that the future was linear, right? I used to think that the future was fixed. It was one-dimensional, right? There was no way to really change the future. It was just one thing and that was it, right? It was one possible event. But when I would use it, right, and I would do my experiments with it, I started to get this sense. I'm like, no, it didn't feel to me like it was fixed. It felt like exactly what I later learned, because I didn't know this at the time, but it felt like what I later learned in near-death experiences say. It felt like, to me, like the future was a set of possibilities, right? And like there was like a highest probability, depending on how I used my psychic abilities, right? I could sort of get a sense of it, right? Or impressions from it, right? But it didn't feel to me that was fixed. And so that's kind of what informs all of this, right? So that's kind of how I come to think of it now, right? That the future isn't really fixed, but your choices determine what future you sort of end up in, right? It determines how you interact with the time function. And pretty much what I'm saying there is that so the time function contains, like I said, all the information about the future events, and every time you make a choice, right, the time function collapses, just like the wave function collapses. Excuse me. Time function collapses just like the wave function. So we'll kind of switch to the wave function collapse interpretation for the time function instead of the many worlds theory. But we still say that there are many events, there are many possible events from my future, similar to what the many worlds theory says. But for the time function, anytime I make a choice, the time function collapses, and now I only get a singular possible event. Right, so I'm only able to experience a single event. So for example, if my tomorrow was an infinite series of possible events, there's infinite number of things I could do tomorrow, right? So I could decide to go to the store, I could decide to go to one of the 50 states, or one of the other 49 states, I should say, right? I could go to I could decide to travel to some other country. I could do any of that, right? It's an infinite number of things. I could decide to write a book tomorrow, right? But the reality, so you consider these, you can consider these all different realities, right, or events. Now the event or the reality I end up in is determined by my choices, right? So whatever choice I make will sort of cause a time function to collapse. Now my tomorrow is just one particular set of events, right, which is what I actually experience as tomorrow. And now it's no longer possible for me to experience tomorrow as one of those other infinite things when I went to the other states or another country or wrote a book or something like that, right? It's no longer possible, which again is exactly what you see in quantum mechanics, right? So when you're measuring a quantum particle, before measurement, the wave function, before measurement, the quantum particle's in superposition, right? And the wave function contains information about all the possible states. After I measure it, the wave function collapses. Now I can only measure it only contains information about a single state, so that's all I'm gonna keep getting each time I measure it. That's how the time function is, right? The moment I get to tomorrow, I make a certain amount of decisions, the time function collapses. Now tomorrow is just one thing I experience and that's it. It's no longer all those infinite things. Now we always, of course, experience the time function at the moment of collapse, so time to us just seems like a linear procession of singular events rather than every possible event. We don't experience the universe as every possible event at once. God actually does experience it that way, right? And I think angels and our higher self can see through time in that way. They can see the possible events and the possibilities, right? And they actually help you, right? Because they can see that stuff, right? We can't, right? If our psychic abilities were turned on, we can see it better, but we're not supposed to do that. That's illegal, right? For what we need to do here on Earth, right? That'll interrupt, right, our goal, right? It makes our goal difficult to still achieve. Like I said, unless you have permission from God, then that's different. But for majority of us, we're not allowed to do that, right? Now in witchcraft, they do that because they're trying to cheat the system, right? And they can do it. God won't stop you, right? But you will pay for it later, which is what I said before. But if you want to sort of get information about the future and things like that, right, you would pray to God and pray to Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit will direct you as needed, right, according to God's will. Right? If you want information about your future, I've gotten information about the future lots of times, right? But I've gotten information about the future lots of times. But it was through, right, God. It wasn't me using my psychic abilities to look into the future, right? And they'll give you information about the future in a particular way, right? So we'll talk more about it in the next chapter. But it's something I call the faith principle, but they'll give you information about the future, not usually in a super direct way. Sometimes they can do that, but that's rare, right? But they give it to you in almost a metaphorical way, which we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. But suffice it to say, they can, in the spirit realm, even demons, right? So negative entities, they can also look into the future. So they can see the future, they can see tomorrow in terms of all the different possibilities, right? We don't see it that way. We just experience it as one possibility. God, I think, is the only one who could see the future in a completely fixed way, right? So in other words, he can see all the possibilities, and he'll see which one will pick, right? Demons, angels, I don't think are able to do that. They can see which one is most likely, but they're not able to see exactly which one will choose. Because I think our consciousness actually exists outside of time and space. Outside of, time and space. And our free will exists outside of time and space. Right? We can interact with time through our free will, but you can't actually just see what we're going to choose. I think God's the only one who can do that. So I just want to mention that. So before I go into a little further, you might ask the question, well, if that's true, right, if I make a choice today, right, let's say I decide to go to the movies, right, and I slip into this universe or this reality. So in this reality, I went to the movies, right? Like I said, let's say it's tomorrow, right, just to make things a little more, easier to understand, right? Tomorrow, let's say tomorrow I decide to go, tomorrow exists as an infinite set of possibilities, but let's say tomorrow I decide to go to the movies. So the time function collapsed, and I went into the reality of all the possible realities. So in one reality, I went to one of the other 49 states. In another reality, I went to another country. In another reality, I went to the zoo, right? In another reality, I wrote a book, right? But based on my choices, I slipped into the reality where I went to the movies, right? Now, if I make a choice to go into that reality, what does that say about the other people on the planet who are all making their own choices, right? Are they in the same reality I am? Are they in other realities different from me? Is the reality that I went into, does it still have them in it? So to me it looks the same, but for them it's different. Now that's an interesting question, and that is something they've thought about with this concept, quantum reality shifting. People have slightly different answers. For me, I believe that everyone's entangled, right? And that's kind of what I was saying earlier. So in other words, to go over this point, it says, all people are entangled within the time function. And what that means is that if I make a choice and cause the time function to collapse for me, that's also going to cause the time function to collapse for you, right, in a particular way. In other words, we're all in sharing the same reality, right? So if I choose to go to the movies tomorrow, you can't make a choice to end up in a reality where I didn't go to the movies, right? So your choices are now limited by my choice, which is exactly what you see in quantum entanglement, right? So that's how I like to think about it. And that's kind of important because what that means is that we all make this, every decision we make affects the entire planet, right? If I make a decision that brings more goodness into the world, which is basically doing anything that's aligned with the Spirit of God, right? If I make a decision that brings more goodness into the world, now you will end up in the world that has more goodness in it, right? If you make a decision that brings less goodness into the world, which is doing something not aligned with the will of God, then I will end up in the world with less goodness in it, right? So that's important. We're all sort of entangled in that way, and that's why we're all, in a sense, responsible for each other to a degree, not completely, but to a degree, right? And this is also what you see said in many near-death experiences, right? So in many near-death experiences, they will look at the way our choices and our decisions impacted and affected other people, right? And they'll see how, I believe it's called the ripple effect, right? They'll see how when we make a choice, it affects someone else, and then affects another person, and so on and so forth, right? And that ultimately is sort of, I believe, sort of a way of looking at this principle, right? It's basically saying that we all impact the world or the reality everyone else ends up in. So you want to make sure you have a positive impact, right? And the only real way to have a positive impact is to follow the will of God. So we're going to talk more about that as relates to manifestation in the next chapter. So to go over this sort of diagram here, basically, this is just kind of a simple kind of way of looking at things. So let's say that let's say I have a friend, right? We kind of went over it already, but I kind of want to go over it again using this diagram, and then we're going to talk about this stuff here. So let's say, these sort of circles here all represent realities or events, right? Now, and I kind of want to show how they're connected or how they're infected sort of in a chain or a flow, right? So let's say that this is reality A, right? So we just start off with reality A. And in reality A, I have a friend, let's say it's a chick, right? And I have the opportunity to say something nice to her or mean to her, right? There's whatever reason, right? So we interacted in some way or have an opportunity to say that. Maybe I say something mean that I meant. Let's say I like her, right? Let's actually make it a little more interesting. Let's say I like her and I'm not sure what to say. I could say something really nice to her. I could try to say something mean, right? To try to look cool or something, right? Now, let's say that if I say something mean, right, then I ended up in this reality C. So the time function collapsed. I'm now in reality C. If I say something nice, I end up in reality B, right? So that's how it works, right? And so if I say something nice and I end up in reality B, right, no longer is reality C possible. I cannot go back in time here and then go here, right, where I said something nice instead, right? Now, I could say something nice here, but I still ended up here because I said something, I could say something mean here, but that will affect the future realities, but it won't be the same as if I said something mean here, right? So if I say something nice here, then I end up in reality B, that's going to impact this chick I'm talking to in a particular way, right? And based on that, let's say I say something nice and she's happy and she feels good about it, and then she says something nice back to me, and then I end up in reality D here, right? Or something else can happen and she says something mean to me anyway, and I end up in reality E. So that's how it works, right? And if I say something mean here, here, and I end up in reality C. So this is reality where I said something mean, right? She might say something mean back to me in a different way from here, and I end up in reality F, and so on and so forth, right? So you can see it's kind of like a chain, right? If I say something, I have different options here. If I say something in reality A, if I choose to say something nice, I end up reality B, and then there's a whole infinite, I didn't show it here, but there's an infinite set of possibilities, right? Get this thing off. So there's an infinite set of possibilities for each of these. And I didn't really show it, but every sort of event has an infinite series of future events and future possibilities. But they're all linked in this kind of chain, right? Every decision we make brings us to a new sort of sequence or chains of events. In fact, I forgot to mention it. One term I used to call it, which is a horrible term, so I am aware of that, right? But it just seems to be the most apt word to use, right? So I call this the possibility verse, right? So the possibility verse is basically the set of all future realities from any particular point, right? So here, me making decisions to travel through these realities is me using my free will or in my choices to travel the possibility verse, right? Which is basically just moving through time, right? So normally we just consider it, time elapsing, right? Or time moving forward. But using this sort of framework, it's slightly different, right? Time isn't just elapsing, right? I'm traveling the possibility verse, right? And I'm going to different realities that have different sort of conditions in them based on the choices I made, right? And I recognize that when I go to one reality, I can never go back. I'm forever sort of stuck with the future realities that are possible from this reality here. So the future realities that branch out from this reality, the only realities possible. The infinite number of realities that branch off from this reality are now impossible for me to reach forever, right? So that's how it works, right? That's you traveling the possibility verse. Now that's, before I move forward, I want to say that you could technically call it a term that's often used in these sort of circles, right? would be the multiverse, right? Which sounds much better, right? But the multiverse, to me, I don't use that term because it sounds more like multiple universes that all exist at the same time, right? That's not really what I'm saying. I'm saying that the universe exists we have one universe and they exist in possible different states, right? That are separated by our choices and the time function. So traveling through time is traveling through the different possible states of this single universe, which is just talking about different possibilities. So like I said, possibility verse sounds terrible, but again, it's just the most accurate way of describing it, right? So now the obvious question to ask is, this is kind of an interesting way to look at time, just like the many worlds theory is an interesting way to look at the nature or the cause of superposition. Really, the cause of a particle being in superposition, the cause of a particle transitioning from a state of superposition to a singular position, right? Or a singular value, right? But what do we gain from using this sort of framework of time? What is better about using this framework from just having a watch and saying time, move forward, right? The main sort of advantage that I believe has to do with metaphysics. So yes, if you're talking just about physics, you probably don't need this, right? Because physics generally just looks at generally just physical materials, right? Things that don't involve our free will, right? It doesn't matter, right? But when we're looking at metaphysics, that does involve our free will. So it makes more sense to use this framework in that context. And when you're using metaphysics, I believe time, you can sort of analyze time in a more full and complete way, right? And so that's kind of what I want to, particularly as it relates to the law of nature of manifestation. We're going to talk about manifestations a lot more in the next chapter, but as it relates to the nature of manifestation, all right? And that's really what I want to spend the rest of the video sort of focus on. So this sort of second, almost half, really just looks at time as it relates to manifestation, right? So to go over this next point, it says subconscious charge impacts time function collapse and the probability of the reality we experience, right? So that's very important, right? So in other words, when we charge our subconscious, right, my argument is that it impacts the flow of time for you, or how you experience the flow of time, or how you travel the possibility verse, right? Now, why is that the case? Well, according to this framework of time, the flow of time, or you traveling a possibility verse, is impacted by your choices, right? By your free will. That causes the time function to collapse. Now, an obvious sort of phenomenon to recognize that's going to be important if that's the case is to recognize that when our subconscious charges, it impacts our free will, right? So that we talked about that. That was like one of the first things we talked about in book 1, right? About the subconscious. So in other words, when our subconscious charges, it compels us, right? It'll compel us and make certain decisions more or less likely. So we talked about in book 1, when you're really hungry, right? What's actually happening is your body's charging your subconscious to compel you to eat food. You can still choose not to eat food, right? You have free will, it's still intact. But it's harder, right? It's more likely that you're going to make a choice to eat food, right? When your body's compelling you in that way, right? That's why it's hard to diet, right? If you're on, your subconscious is charged up at the laughter frequency, right? You're going to feel compelled to laugh, right? You don't have to, right? You could hold it back if you want to, right? But it's more likely that you're going to just choose to laugh if your subconscious is charged on that frequency. And the more it's charged on that frequency, the more intense the compulsion and the higher the probability, right? So if I feel something's only a little bit funny to me, meaning a weak charge at the laughter frequency, I might not laugh at it. I might, smirk a little bit, but I may not choose to laugh, especially if let's say I'm in a library or a classroom or whatever. Now, if it's charged up very intensely after laughter frequency, there's a much higher probability I'm just going to choose to laugh, right? It's too hard to resist, right? So in other words, because our subconscious charge affects or impacts our choice, that means the charge is going to directly impact how we travel the possibility verse, right? Or put another way, and this is very important, right? It's going to affect what reality is most likely to manifest. In fact, that really gets to this point here. It says the reality with the most energy has the greatest probability of manifesting, right? So that's actually very important. That would almost be like this is almost similar to the quantum mechanical rule, right? Which says that the highest, pretty much, it's kind of like the, was pretty much said with the Schrodinger wave equation, right? So the Schrodinger wave equation says that you have the highest probability of measuring a particular, getting a certain observable value when you measure a quantum particle. The highest probability is going to be related to the square amplitude of the wave function, right, relative to a particular observable a particular operator. I'm kind of going a little too much into detail with it. It would be the eigenvalue of a particular operator. But suffice it to say, the probability of some observable value is proportional to square of the amplitude of the wave function, right? The higher the eigenvalue, the higher the probability, right, of you measuring that value when you measure the quantum particle. And that's kind of what this is saying. This is kind of the metaphysical version of that as it relates to the nature of manifestation, right? So the reality that has the most energy, and by that I'm referring to subconscious energy, right, has the greatest probability of manifesting. So what do I mean by manifestation? Basically, when we said that manifestation is basically the, we talked about a manifestation charge, right? But you can think of manifestation as the reality that you're most likely to end up in, right? Or no, I'll just say the reality you end up in is going to be a reflection of the intentions you produced in the past, right? So if I end up in reality D here, that means there's a particular sequence of intentions I made in each one of these realities to get here. So in other words, you can argue that these sequence of intentions through these realities manifested reality D. So that's really what we mean by the term manifestation, right? It's the, I'll talk a little more about it in the next chapter, but you can think of it as the set or pattern of intentions you produce, right? The reality you end up in, or the reality you create or manifest, right, is going to be directly related to the set of intentions you produced in the past. So, if I produce particular intentions here, here, and here, I will manifest reality D, right? If I produce intention here, particular intention here, and end up in this reality here, then I end up in this reality here, then these set of intentions manifested reality F. They didn't manifest this reality, right? I would have to produce a different set of intentions to get to reality D, right? And so now the reality that has the most energy, right, or the reality where I had, actually, there's one other thing to talk about before I get there. So let's say that I charge my subconscious at a particular frequency in reality A, right? Now, if I do that in reality A, it's going to be, let me see, I was thinking if there's one other thing I want to talk about. No, I think I'm going to try to get through this. This is something else that probably makes more sense to talk about, but no, I'll just go through it now. So let's say I charge my subconscious at a particular frequency, right, in reality A. Well, that charge is going to impact my choices, right? So let's say I'm more likely to end up in B with that charge than C. Right, now let's say I chose not to charge my subconscious at that frequency. So let's say in reality C is more likely for me to end up in if I don't have that charge. Reality B is more likely for me to end up in if I do have that charge. Well, what that means, another way of kind of looking at that, is now these realities, I didn't make a distinction of how many different choices is possible in each one of these realities, right? This could represent a total 24 set of choices I make in a 24-hour period, right? And then these sets are another 24-hour period, these another 20, so this is day 3, day 2, and day 1, right? I could also make it so this is minute 1, minute 2, and minute 3. It just depends on how specific I want to get with these branch points, right? So let's do something similar to what they do in differential equations and in physics, right? So in physics, they look at very tiny infinitesimal changes, right, in a particle, right? Which is why they use derivatives or differential equations. With differentials or derivatives, you look at rate of change for infinitesimal distance, right? And so let's say we do that here. If I charge my subconscious in a particular way, right, and I I look at the next set of events, let's say, 5 seconds later, right? So not infinitesimal, let's just say 5 seconds later, right? Then within these 5 second period, I'm still going to have my subconscious charge, right? Why? Because the subconscious discharges slowly, right? It's not instantaneous, right? So if I do perform a charge here, and I end up in this reality, if I'm more likely to end up in this reality as a result of my charge, then it's likely that in this reality, I also have that charge, right? Even if it's 5 seconds. If I'm unlikely to end up in this reality, if I'm more likely to end up in this reality without the charge, then it's reasonable to presume that in this reality I didn't have my charge. Right now, why is that important? Why is that an important thing to sort of analyze? Well, what it says is that if I have a subconscious charge, right, especially if I maintain it, I'm more likely to end up in a reality that preserves the charge. Now, again, it does depend on how specific I want to get it depends on how specific I want to get or how short I want to make the time frames, right, between these different realities, right? But let's just say as a general rule for the moment, let's just say as a general rule for very short times, right, the reality I'm more likely to end up in, right, is a reality, or more like if I have a charge in one reality, I'm more likely to end up in another reality where I still have that charge, right, because the subconscious charges and discharges like transiently, has a transient nature, which we talked about in book 1, right? So now let's say that I maintain that charge, right? So I charge in a particular frequency, and then I decide to hold that charge. I keep charging it, and I just keep it charged for days or weeks, right? And I don't let it discharge. Well, what that means is I'm going to keep ending up in realities, right, where I still have that charge, right, where I maintain that charge, and that's going to keep impacting my decisions, right? And what's going to end up happening is that charge is going to continuously impact my decisions, and it's going to cause me to get to future, or it's going to sort of influence the trajectory, right, or how I travel the possibility verse. So it's going to impact, in other words, what reality manifests. And another consequence of that is the reality where I have a particular charge, or I have the highest charge, is kind of what that's saying, is the reality most likely to manifest. So that's how I look at it. So for example, let's say that in this reality, right, I have a huge charge of the humor frequency, right? So I'm laughing like crazy, or for whatever reason, right? Let's say that I'm going to, I'm watching funny movies, I'm going to see a comedian, I'm making jokes with people at work, things like that, right? So in this reality, I have that huge charge of humor. I'm charging that frequency all throughout the day. Right now, let's say here, I just have a little bit of the humor frequency, right, charged up, or laughter frequency. I could go to different realities, right? I don't have to keep it charged. I could go to some reality where I charge up the anger frequency, right? But if I decide to keep charging it, right, then it's going to keep impacting my decisions, right? If I keep it charged, that meant I kept doing stuff, or I could just charge it to my attention. But that also means that I kept choosing to do things that kept it charged, right? So I could use my intention, I could watch movies, I could see a comedian, things like that. So if the charge is growing in intensity, that means I'm doing things to cause it to grow, right? Then it means most likely I'm going to end up in some reality where it has more of a charge, right? Because that was my choice, right? It's unlikely for me let's say I keep doing that, end up in this reality D, that has a huge charge. It'd be unlikely for me to increase the charge, right, or maintain a high charge from reality B, and then end up in reality G where I had no charge at all, right? That I suppose it's possible to begin, depending on how specific I want to get my time frames here, but it's unlikely, right? Because that charge impacted me to make a decision to do something that at least maintained the charge or increased it, right? The laughter frequency. And so ultimately, hopefully I explained that well, but what it means is that the reality that has the most intense subconscious charge is the one that's most likely to manifest, right? Now you might say, let's say I'm looking at a year from now, right? There are of course an infinite number of realities that have all types of, where I'm in those realities with all types of different charges, right? So what does it mean to say one is the most likely to manifest? Well, the one most likely to manifest represents the charge that I hold, right? So if I start in this reality A and I just keep holding a particular charge at a particular frequency, right, then the one that's most likely to manifest, like I said, will be the one with the most energy, because that's the one I'm going to move toward more and more and more and more, because my decisions as a result of my charge continuously are impacted by my charge. Right? It's unlikely I'm going to end up some reality that has some other subconscious charge, right? Especially again because the subconscious discharges in a transient way. So, hopefully I explained that well, but you can see that that's exactly how I explained the manifestation charge previously, right? So I said that you have to hold on to the charge. You have to maintain it, right? If you do the manifestation charge, right, and then you just decide, I'm done with this, and let the energy discharge, then this process is going to break up. Now you're going to go to a whole bunch of different realities that don't have that charge, right? And so now you're not controlling, in a more specific sense, how you travel the possibility first. Or put another way, you're not manifesting a reality properly, right? So if I decide to charge at a particular frequency and then maintain it, then that's going to allow me to travel the possibility first very nicely, right? And there's actually another component to that process, which I want to now talk about, which we went into a little bit before. I think I explained it before in the other videos, but I'll just go over this part here. So it says normal psychic abilities influence inspiration. I don't know what I wrote there. So normal psychic abilities influence inspiration by obtaining impressions from future realities, right? So I think I mentioned that briefly before, but what I now believe, right, is that this is what happens with your psychic abilities. So we talked about how you have normal psychic abilities, or what I call sensing in the spirit, right? So you can charge your psychic abilities, charging a whole bunch of psychic energy and things like that. Now that's illegal for most people, but your subconscious still charges a little bit. You could almost call it a weak charge, which is a new thing, right, that I made up. So a weak charge in this case would be when you, your body's dampening your subconscious so your spirit doesn't charge up. It's dampening your subconscious so you don't charge a lot of psychic energy. Because of that, your spirit doesn't sense that much, right? You're just relying on your physical body senses. But what I believe happens, right, is let's say and by the way, this has to do with the absolute nature of the subconscious. So this is just how God designed your subconscious to respond to your intention. What I believe happens is when you continuously try or continuously tell yourself, like, I want to accomplish this, I want to achieve this, right? I want to figure out how to do this. Let's say I want to be rich, right? And I'm constantly thinking of how to be a rich person. What do I need to do to be rich and get money, right? And if I keep coming, let's say this is the planning component of the manifestation process, and I keep thinking of how to be rich, I keep holding that intention. What I believe happens, right, is that our subconscious responds to that intention, right? That's the command God gave it. That's how God told our subconscious to respond to that type of command. When I hold that intention, I believe our subconscious charges a little bit of psychic energy, right, very weakly. If we do it enough, right, still charges it a little bit, right, within the dampening of our body, the influence of the dampening of our body. And what our spirit will do is it'll lock on, in a sense, to one of these future realities where we're rich, right? Because that's what I'm wanting, right? I want to know how to be rich. So my subconscious responds by focusing on my spirit focuses on the future reality where I'm rich, right? And what ends up happening is it gains information about that future reality to inspire me, right? To make decisions to end up in that reality. So that's kind of interesting, right? But that's how I believe God designed things. So let's say there's a future reality where I am rich, right? So there's a future reality where I'm rich. There's one where I'm a bum on the street, right? There's one where I work in the Stop and Shop. There's one when I'm injured, maybe I'm paralyzed or something, right? So there's all different future realities based on possible choices that I'm able to make today, and even in the past, right? And of course, there'll be an infinite set of realities that are no longer possible to me to reach from decisions I make in the present, right? But let's say from this present moment, there are still all types of future possible realities. There's an infinite set, right? Now, in some of those realities, I'm a rich person, right? And many of them I'm not. So if I keep holding the intention that says I want to be rich, I want to know how to make money, I believe our spirit will sense a future reality, a future reality where I'm rich, and then we'll get an impression. So we talked about impressions in the chapter 7. it'll get an impression. So let's say in that reality, I got rich by selling sneakers, right? So just something totally random, right? What's going to end up happening is I'll get an impression from that reality, right, about sneakers, right, and in kind of my business or something like that, right? And now in the moment when I'm thinking about, how do I get rich? How do I get rich? I'll just have an inspired thought about sneakers, right, and maybe something to do with it. Now, to me, I won't know that's a psychic ability. I won't know any of that. My pineal gland won't react because the psychic energy is too low. I'll have no idea that just happened. My spirit reached out to a future reality, got an impression. To me, though, it'll just be an inspired thought, right? That's how I'll experience it. And I'll just be thinking, like, what if I sell sneakers, right? And there may be other things I get from that future reality, right? Especially if I keep holding a charge, which is exactly how you perform a manifestation charge. So if I keep holding this charge, my spirit, so remember, the voluntary components of psychic abilities connects or transcendentally connects to things, right? So if I keep doing this, let's say my spirit transcendentally connects to information from a future reality, and I keep sort of getting impressions from that reality, right? It doesn't even have to be a singular reality as I'm describing it, right? It could be multiple different realities kind of around the idea of being rich, right? In one reality where I'm rich one reality where I'm a millionaire from selling sneakers, maybe I live in New York, and another one I might live in Florida, another one I might live in Texas, right? One reality I could have 5 kids, another reality I have 10 kids, whatever, right? But ultimately so you see there's kind of a spread of realities, right? With different conditions and things like that, but ultimately in all of these realities, the thing that's consistent is I'm rich selling sneakers. So if I keep locking on to these realities, if I keep focusing on being rich, especially if I get the inspired thought to be rich by selling sneakers, right? Now my spirit is locking on to these particular future realities where I'm rich by selling sneakers. And I might get different impressions from those realities. But ultimately, a lot of the impressions that I'm going to get are going to inspire me to make decisions, right, that help me to draw nearer to that reality. So let's say there's a set of realities, right? Let's say here I start making choice. Let's say there's some future reality here, right, where I'm rich selling sneakers. And at all the future realities here, I'm not rich selling sneakers, right? So I can never be rich selling sneakers if I make this choice. Well, when I charge here, I'm going to make this choice here. And then that charge will cause me to make another choice to end up here, and so on and so forth, until I get closer and closer and closer to that reality where I'm rich selling sneakers. So I believe the psychic component, so that's very important, right? So our psychic abilities actually inform, right, the intelligence component or the planning component of manifestation. And they help us to sort of make decisions to bring us closer and closer and closer to a future reality. Right? So that's a very important component of manifestation. And that's related, you would do that by maintaining a subconscious charge. It doesn't have to be the charge at the same frequency. So we talked about that with the manifestation charge. But if you keep your subconscious charge and you just keep it charged in different ways, right? So the 3 ways we talked about, you're going to keep making decisions to help you to lock onto the future that you got impressions from for your psychic abilities. So another important component to talk about is alignment. So to go over here, it says alignment occurs when multiple people act according to impressions from future realities. So this is also important, right? So let's say that in some future reality, right, I get an impression from a future reality. In that reality, so that reality in the future, the past of that reality, right, let's say in the past of that future reality, I ended up, getting a loan from my best friend or something, right? Then I might, let's say I end up getting a loan from my best friend, but my best friend was looking, not my best friend, let's not make it, it won't really make sense what I'm saying if it's my best friend. Let's say that there's someone who wants to make an investment in some future idea. They don't know what yet, they're not sure, but they want to make an investment, right? And they're looking for someone to invest, right? And let's say in my past, or the past of the future reality where I was a millionaire, I met this investor, right? Let's say I met this investor in, some college or something, right? Let's say that investor's holding intention to look for a business to invest to, and I'm holding the intention to make money. In part of the planning process of manifestation charge, I'm like, I need like a loan, right? to invest. I need a loan to develop my business, right? So, but in the past of my future reality, I met that investor, and that helped me to start my business, right? So that's the past of that future reality. If we're both charging that intention of like, look, he's looking for someone to invest in, I'm looking for an investor, right? The impressions, we can both be getting impressions from that same future, right? Then that may just inspire us. Again, we won't know why. We'll just have an inspired thought to do something one day, right? And there are different things that can inspire you at the subconscious level. I should mention, I don't know if I mentioned before, like God can do it, your higher self can do it. So they can all help you to manifest a particular reality, right? But let's just say for the moment that, it's just our psychic abilities, right? So we're focused on a future reality, then we may get inspired, we may get an impression from that future reality that inspires us to, this person might say, you know what, let me just go to this college, right? See if there's people there or something like that. And I might say, whatever reason, I don't know why I was at college, but let's just say there's some reason I was at college. Those inspired thoughts could bring us together, right? And then we end up meeting each other and things like that. So you could say that we're in alignment, right, with what we're both trying to manifest. So that's the alignment component of manifestation, which I think we talked about before, but this is kind of how it looks relative to this concept of quantum reality shifting, right? So, so we're almost done. So now the next thing I want to talk about is kind of like, you can almost think of it as normal manifestation, or what happens when you try to manifest without the uses of subconscious energy, right? To go to this point, it says the negative mind cannot increase the probability of any reality manifesting since it has no energy. Now this is important, right? Because I believe this is how a lot of people actually try to engage in manifestation, and this doesn't work, right? It's horrible. So we looked at before how to perform a proper manifestation charge, right, requires a huge amount of discipline, right? Because you got to maintain a subconscious charge. You're not going to be able to do 100 other things with your subconscious and charge all these more fun, pleasurable sort of, or have more fun, pleasurable experiences because you're charging your subconscious at these positive frequencies. No, you're not going to be able to do that, right? You just got to maintain a charge doing those 3 steps over and over and over again until you finally achieve your goal, right? Now, let's say that you don't want to do that, right? Let's say you don't even want to charge your subconscious at all, right? So we're going to the complete extreme of the negative mind. Well, what happens? Well, remember we said that the reality of the highest probability of manifesting is the one that has the most subconscious energy. And that's because that largely is a consequence of the fact that your subconscious will compel you more and impact your decisions more, right? As the more charged up it is. But if you don't have any charge, then really there's no reality that's really that much more likely than any other reality, right? At least according to that principle. Now you could say that there are certain conditions that make some realities more possible. True. But it's not going to be that much different. It's not going to be that much different, right? Not different enough to be significant, right? Because you don't have a subconscious charge, right? You're not more likely really to make any other decision versus you're not more likely to make a particular decision over another decision in terms of your charge. You could be more likely in terms of other things in your reality, but not in terms of your charge, right? And so the odds of me going from one reality to another isn't really that particularly high, right? It's nothing really special, right? And so trying to navigate the possibility versus simply using your negative mind and not having any subconscious charge would be a horrible way to try to manifest something, right? Because no reality is more likely as a result of your subconscious charge, right? And especially due to this fact, you're not getting impressions from any future reality, right? And so this would be normal manifestation, which is virtually just using your free will, right? And when a lot of people, which I talked about in the previous video, right? A lot of people, they don't have the discipline to maintain a subconscious charge for a long period of time, right? They're focused on 100 other things. And so there are a lot of times they're trying to manifest something, not exactly like this, because they still charge up at other frequencies, but they're, in a sense, they approximate this, right? They're trying to manifest some reality using just their negative mind. And that's a horrible way to do it. It's going to be too hard. You're not going to get impressions from the future reality. Now, like I said, God and your higher self can still inform your decisions, and they do. But we'll talk more about that next chapter, right? They wouldn't necessarily use it, right, in the way that you might want to, right, in the moment, right? But But ultimately, just looking at you, though, for the moment, this would not be a great way to manifest at all, right? But that's what I believe a lot of people do, because their attention is focused on a million different things. So they don't have a great ability to manifest their reality. And so the last thing I want to talk about is it says that each reality manifested also has a set of conditions whose probability is predetermined by the intention and frequency. And I call these reality conditions. So this is important, right? And basically what I'm getting at there is the reality that you end up in is going to have a certain set of conditions, right? So for example, let's say I end up in a reality where I'm a millionaire, right? So that's a reality I manifested. The reality where I'm a millionaire should have a set of conditions, right? In that reality, of course, I have $1 million, right? I have something that makes me worth $1 million. You can imagine that if, in that reality, also according to the way we set up, I'm also a business owner. Now you can imagine if that's true, there are probably other things, right? Maybe I have a nice house, right? I have a nice car, right? I'm not, injured or something, right? I can work and I'm healthy, right? I'm not sick, right? So you can imagine that there are certain conditions that are going to make sense for that particular reality, right? In that reality, let's say I'm charging at a frequency of ambition, right? And integrity, right? You can imagine I'm not going to end up in a reality where I'm constantly trying to, I did something illegal. I'm constantly trying to avoid being prosecuted by the law or something, or caught by the law, right? Because I charged up with integrity. Now, if I charged up at a frequency of deceit and avarice, then maybe I could end up in a reality like that based on that frequency, right? So, in other words, the frequency is going to play a component in what decisions I make, right? If I have integrity, I'm not going to take less scrupulous, right? Or unscrupulous, I'm not going to engage in unscrupulous activities to make money, right? So if I keep holding intention to make money, there are realities where maybe I'm a drug dealer, or maybe I'm an assassin or something like that, right? I'm unlikely to end up in those realities if I'm charging at the frequency of integrity, right? So then now I'm only going to make decisions where I'm going to end up in the realities where I got it in a way that reflects integrity. So the frequency of the charge that I'm holding to navigate the possibility verse is going to sort of play a role, right, in what reality I end up in. And that's also going to be the reality that I get impressions from, right? And so that's why I say there's certain reality conditions, right? There are conditions. Now, I'm not in control of all those conditions, no, right? Something could happen, the whole country could go through a depression, right? But I'm still going to be in a future reality in that country, right? Because, in other words, if I make future choices, right, and I'm still in this country, then I'm going to be affected by that depression, right? So there are other things that affect the reality conditions, right? But just in terms of what the reality conditions that I can more directly impact by my choices, they're in some ways going to be a reflection of my intention and the frequency, right? And I just say intention because, if I want to be a millionaire, right, I could decide to be a millionaire, I could decide to want to be president, right, or a congressman or whatever, right? So holding that particular intention, or let's say I want to be a millionaire, right, to be more specific, there are different ways I could be a millionaire, right, and that will be incorporated by my intention, right? If I want to be a millionaire selling sneakers, or I could be a millionaire opening a restaurant or selling a book or whatever, right? But the other components of that is the frequency. So basically the combination of the two says that depending on the intention and the frequency, there will be certain conditions, right, in the reality that I manifest, right? And now this is going to be very important for what we talk about next chapter, because, and I don't know if I mentioned it in the other video, but yeah, so when you're the highest way to manifest, right, the highest type of manifestation you could pull off, right, is a manifestation that is informed by God. So we talked about how it's informed by your psychic abilities. You can also do it in a way that's informed by God. And that's basically kind of what all of next chapter is going to be about. All the consequences of doing that. Sort of navigating the possibility verse in a way that's directed by the Holy Spirit. Right? And so that's pretty much all of, for the most part, all of next chapter. But yeah, if you were doing it in a more individual way, then you would focus on this. This is basically the process of how it works, right? So So yeah, I think that's it. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to talk about. All right, so there actually was one other thing I did want to talk about, and that has to do with the concept of what I call a critical point, which is a particular point in time where you basically have to make a certain decision by that time to reach future realities, or you're just unable to reach it, right? And that's kind of what we talked about before. But I'm going to talk about this more in the context of God and basically manifesting according to the will of God and your purpose and things like that, which we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. But an example I kind of want to give for that has to do with something I read about in a book with Carrie Koenig, so 5 Lessons of Life, I believe it's called. I always get confused on the name. I think it's 5 Lessons of Life. But she was basically saying how she kept getting I think if my memory serves me, she kept getting like intuitive sort of nudges, right, on what her purpose in life is and what she was supposed to do, which I kind of talked about that, right? So you'll get those intuitive nudges on a level of your subconscious. You may see certain things during your day that just stand out to you. That can be the result of a suggestion planted in your subconscious to alter your perception to perceive this thing. You'll sense certain things in the spirit regarding what you're supposed to do, and you may have certain dreams or visions about your purpose. So we'll talk more about the nature of dreams in the next chapter. But suffice it to say, she had all of that relating to her purpose, right? But she kept rejecting it, right? So she kept rejecting it, and she had her reasons. I forget what they were. But she kept sort of shying away from them and avoiding it. So she wasn't engaging with her purpose, what she was supposed to do, right? And what ended up happening, so she's one of those people who I believe, I don't know if she still has it, but she had like her psychic abilities sort of turned on at certain points, or maybe it was an exemption where an angel appeared to her. I'm not sure, but I think she had like her psychic abilities turned on at one point, and she could see an angel, right? So I believe that, if my memory serves me, because I haven't actually read it in a while, but an angel appeared to her, right, and told her that she basically had to accept her purpose, and if she didn't, so she was going to be invited for something. I forget what it was, some type of spiritual thing, right, by people that she knew, right, according to her book. Or at least when the angel appeared to her, I believe the angel was basically telling her she was going to be invited, and that she had to agree to it. And the angel was telling her that if she didn't agree to it, this was basically her last chance to still engage with her purpose, right? And if she didn't do it, then she was basically just going to live the rest of her life, right, in pretty much mediocrity, right? So insipid mediocrity. She wouldn't really be able to engage with any purpose. It wasn't going to be much for her to do, because she pretty much missed her chance to engage with her purpose, right? Now that's an interesting thing to say, right? Why not just be able to engage with your purpose later if you miss this chance? And the reason has to do with this, right? So in other words, what the angel was telling her was that in order for her to get to these future realities, right, that involve her carrying out her purpose, she had to make a certain decision by a certain time. So let's say she wants to get to reality B, she's in position A, then she has to make a choice to go to reality B, and then all the realities that branch off from that point. So if she makes a decision to go to reality C, she can never get any of those future realities, right? And all the realities that branch off from this point have nothing to do with what her God-given purpose was. So that's why she's basically just going to live the rest of her life pretty much in mediocrity and not really feeling much of anything. We'll talk a little more about purpose in the next chapter. But so A is a very special sort of state related to her purpose, right? Because now she has to make a choice just right here. She has to make a choice right here to end up reality B, where now she can carry out her purpose. So A is what you would call a critical point. So that's kind of the term I just used for it. Now let's say that she, just sort of making something up here, so let's say that she's, which I didn't give them letters, but let's say she's at this point here, right? And she's trying to get to reality B. Well, this is not a critical point, right? Because she can make a choice to go here. She can make a choice to end up in this reality. She can end up in this reality. All of these, the way I kind of draw it, well, let me actually draw it a little bit more accurate. This way, yeah. So from any one of these choices, she could end up in reality A, from this choice, she can end up in this reality and still end up getting to B. That's kind of how I really went to draw it. She could still end up getting to reality B by not going to reality A. In other words, none of these are critical points, right? Now, when she gets here, she can still end up in reality B by going to A or going to this reality. So these are not critical points to get to reality B. This is a critical point because she can't get to B without making a choice here. If she doesn't make the right choice here, then she's forever cut off from all the realities that branch off to reality B. So that's basically what I mean by the concept of critical point. It's critical. You have an opportunity to make a critical decision, right? And that actually happened to me in my life, right, where I basically received a plan from God, right, through my dreams and through inner knowings and things like that, where I was in a plan with actually another person and we were supposed to do something together, right? And we had the idea that we were going to do it kind of later, and we were getting both of us were getting messages in our dreams and from God that, no, we needed to do it sooner, which we didn't know the reason why, but we didn't really listen, right? So at least we didn't understand how soon it was supposed to be, right? And then one day I just started getting dreams as if the plan is now changed, right? And I'm like, why am I getting dreams like this, where this is what I know they plan to be, right? And the dreams I kept getting them every single night, right? Every single night, because at first I'm resisting. I'm like, no, this is something else. I know what the plan God gave me is, right? And it just kept, every night I would get a more and more and more intense dream. Now at first they were very like, I don't know the word. It's like they were, and again, we'll talk more about dreams in the next chapter, because then it would make more sense what I'm saying. But suffice it to say, the dreams were more like recognizing that I was kind of worried that maybe I'm being deceived or something, right, by some negative entity. So no. So I started having dreams that were saying no, right? I could feel, one of my dreams, I could feel the presence of Jesus. Like I saw this cross that like was filling up with this golden light, which was amazing, right? Like, but they were showing me things like that. I felt the presence of this angel. I actually felt the presence of like 3 angels in that dream. So they're letting me feel their presence. And so I understood, no, this is from God. The plan simply changed, right? And I didn't know why at first, but I did understand the reason why. It wasn't related to anything I did, right? But suffice it to say, the plan changed. And what I recognized from that point, and this is kind of why I kept getting messages to hurry up, is that basically I crossed a critical point, right? So in the purpose that I was supposed to carry out, right, I had reached a point where I have to carry out this purpose then, or I just can't carry out. I cross off, and I can only branch into future realities where I can't carry out that purpose anymore. And that's why I was getting warnings. Me and this other person were getting warnings to do it faster, right? So when you receive messages from God to carry out purpose and things like that, you will also likely get, and if you're procrastinating too much, right, you'll get warnings. So they always warn you, right, if you're close to a critical point. They don't always tell you specifically when you're like, okay, you have to do it now or never again, right? Sometimes I've heard people who may get messages kind of like that, but like Carrie Cohen. But you don't always get that, right? You'll just get warnings, and then if you don't do what you're supposed to do, you'll just notice one day your plan has changed and then you can't go back. That's it, right? You missed your chance, right? So you want to be careful with that, right? If you want to follow the will of God, and you're receiving messages from God, your angels, things like that, you want to you want to follow it. You want to heed any warnings you get, because God will always warn you before you reach a point like that, right, where it's about to be just too late, right, and you're done. And another thing I want to talk about that also happened to me is, so I talked about how you can sense in the spirit, right? So for normal psychic abilities, sensing in the spirit, you can sense changes in the timeline. So that's also something I noticed, right? So when you're following the will of God, and you're in a state of repentance, your spirit becomes far more sensitive to things that are holy, right? So it becomes more sensitive to the Spirit of God, angels, but also becomes more sensitive to your purpose, right? Because when you're living in sin and things like that, the Spirit of God, its influence in your life recedes, right? And you become more sensitive to, less sensitive to the Spirit of God, although you can shock charge it more. That's a little bit different, right? You're more sensitive to negativity, right? Demonic entities and things like that. But when you're living with the Spirit of God, you can become more sensitive to changes in the timeline related to your purpose, right? And they feel good. For example, when we had crossed that critical point, right, related to the purpose I was talking about, I could sense it. I could feel it. It's like something changed and it felt negative, right? And I felt it like all day, and it felt like it was related to the plan or the purpose that God had given me and this other person, right? So in other words, I was sensing a change in the timeline, but I didn't quite understand it at the time, right? But I just knew it, and the other person sensed it too. It's like we can both pinpoint almost the day that we just both felt something had changed. Something was different. Couldn't quite put our finger on it. That was a change in the timeline, right? And another day I had done something else, right, where I had basically came up with an idea and I put it in the book. And since that day, I felt like something different. It's like I felt a change in the timeline. It felt positive, so it felt good. It's like because I put that thing in the book, it altered the future in a particular way that was good, right? And there was no going back from it. The future is officially set in stone for a positive effect, right? And around that day, I actually kept feeling the presence of Jesus Christ. And I was like, why do I keep feeling the presence of Jesus? Now I think about Jesus all the time, right? But this time felt a little different. I kept feeling the presence of Jesus. And then when I went to sleep, I had a dream about him, right? And now, like I said, I think about him all the time and don't dream about him, but I dreamed about him this day. So I think that was his way of letting me know that I had done good, right? That this was a good thing and it led to a positive change in the future, right? So that's just one thing I also want to mention, right? So your spirit can sense changes in the timeline. When you cross a critical point, if it's good, you're going to sense a kind of change in time that's positive. If you cross a critical point that's negative, you're going to sense a change of time that's negative. When you now it might be hard to kind of explain, or it's hard to think about now, right, if you're not used to it, but when you're used to following the will of God, you're going to just start sensing them, right? Because now you're sensitive enough to things that are holy, right? That includes your purpose, which we're going to talk more about that later. So yeah, that's pretty much the last thing I wanted to talk about. I forgot to put that in. In the next video, we're going to talk about your fourth level of awareness, which I call the higher self, right? So I'm going to talk about that and kind of a little bit of how I came up to that idea. But yeah, that's it for now, though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.